Look, I'm going to ask the question. Are we in the dawn of a brand new era of BYU athletics, and can it be this fun for the foreseeable future? Well, I sure hope so.
You are Locked On Cougars, your daily podcast on the BYU Cougars, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What's up, everybody? I'm Jake Hatch, your host here on Locked On Cougars, resident BYU insider. Thank you for making Locked On Cougars your first listen of the day. And as always, thank you to all of you who are everydayers with us right here on your original daily podcast focused on the BYU Cougars. All right, coming up on today's show, we're talking BYU sports in general, more specifically about BYU basketball after a monumental upset of Iowa State last night. Are we living the good old days for BYU athletics suddenly once again? We'll talk more about the unsung heroes for this BYU basketball team that could be key difference makers if they want to make a run in March Madness. And we'll finish up today's show talking about the Big 12 and what they're trying to do to catch the SEC and the Big 10 and why it's actually not a bad thing, even though it may look like it on its head. All right, so the BYU basketball team got a huge win over Iowa State last night. Monumental upset, double overtime. Team had to battle through so much, 29 turnovers. No team in more than 20 years had picked up such a win on an opposing floor against a ranked opponent. Incredible stuff. If you want more game-specific stuff, check out the postcast edition we did moments after that game went final. It's available wherever you get your podcast. I don't mind if you stop this one, go listen to that one, and then come right back to this edition. But the bigger point I wanted to make is we're watching BYU sports do some incredible things of late. I got to give a shout-out to our good friend Cougar Stats for this point. It's calling it the greatest 7-game stretch in BYU basketball history. Now, allow him to explain this. 5-0 against quad 1 teams, 3-0 against ranked teams, beat number 19 Arizona in Tucson in the McHale Center, beat number 10 Iowa State in Ames in the Hilton Coliseum last night, and then the third biggest beatdown of number 22 Kansas at the time in their 125 years of illustrious history for the Kansas Jayhawks. We're watching BYU do incredible things. And you combine the surge that BYU basketball has right now under Kevin Young, and it feels like they're just beginning what could be an incredible run for the BYU Hoops program. We just went through probably the greatest single season in terms of just overall level of difficulty for BYU football. A monumental 11-2 record, and there are still things left to accomplish for that BYU football program, but they had never in their history accomplished what they accomplished with 9 Power 5 wins on that schedule. Yes, you would have traded maybe a win or two to go to a Big 12 title game and to go to the college football playoff, but it feels like we are entering a new era of BYU athletics. And if it's going to hold like it is right now, because I've got no reason to think it's not going to, because think about this. BYU football has got a ton of its talent, the returning talent coming back to this program that went 11-2 a year ago. You think with some extra development, some of the horses they added, to use that expression, in the transfer portal, they should be poised to do some really special things this fall. This BYU basketball team, well, they have Yegor Devin, they have Cannon Catching, they have some really nice one-and-done type pieces on this team, but they have one of the ultimate one-and-done pieces coming into the program next year in AJ DiBonsa. We're looking at maybe we're entering one of those periods of BYU sports that you and I and many other Cougar fans out there watching and or listening to this may refer to one day as the good old days. I am young enough to remember my grandfather and my dad talking about the 1980s of BYU football, the 1984 national championship, talking about Danny Ainge and his dash to glory to beat Notre Dame to win that was a Sweet 16 matchup to advance to the Elite Eight. They talked often about those days, and I wasn't alive for them. I was born in 1987, so I'm a relative young buck for some of you out there watching and or listening to this. The halcyon days for me really probably are that mid-90s period, maybe the late 20-aughts, but we're entering, I think, what could be an absolutely electric era for BYU athletics, led by the BYU football and BYU men's basketball teams. We're watching the cross-country programs win dual national titles to extend it out. Men's volleyball is a powerhouse. Women's volleyball is a perennial NCAA tournament contender. Women's soccer, we're watching Jennifer Rockwood just do incredible things. BYU athletics has never been in a better spot, and Tom Homo is going to step aside, and whoever takes over as BYU athletic director has got to be very thinking their lucky stars that Homo is letting them step in and essentially take over this humming machine and say, hey, just don't screw it up. That's really how it feels for BYU athletics. But the bigger, I guess, overarching theme of what I wanted to start today's podcast is I was watching what BYU did against Iowa State last night. I'm like, you know what? I have young kids. I've got a daughter who's 8, a son who's 6, and my youngest is 1.5. And they're growing up and they're watching BYU sports, and maybe they watch a lot of other sports because, as many of you know, I have a job that requires I watch a ton of games. Utah Jazz, Utah Hockey Club. Yes, I watch the Utes. Yes, I watch Utah State. It's nature of sports radio to watch all that. But they're growing up and they're watching BYU do some incredible things, and I'm excited for them to if this is kind of like the 3, 2, 1 launch of what could be, like I said, an epic era of BYU athletics. They're going to have some really, really fun times ahead. BYU's got great coaches in place. They have never had more funding. Speaking of all sources, NIL, TV rights, everything that's coming into the BYU athletic department should have it flush with cash. And so long as they don't screw it up, to use that expression once again, the halcyon days of what we're experiencing with BYU sports could roll on for the foreseeable future. Now, could it all come tumbling down? Sure, I acknowledge that. But what they're accomplishing right now, Cougar Stats saying that the best 7-game stretch in BYU basketball history, I'd have a hard time arguing against that. Now, you could argue that some of the runs in the NCAA tournament, like I mentioned, that Danny Ainge run, what Jimmer Fredette accomplished his senior year with BYU basketball, some pretty incredible runs. But considering, much like the BYU football program this past year, the level of competition, this is the Power 4 ranks, the Big 12 considered one of the preeminent, if not the preeminent college basketball conference. And you're doing what you're doing right now with Kevin Young's program and thinking back to what Kalani Sitake accomplished in his second year in the Big 12 conference. This is a really, really exciting time to be a BYU fan. And we're going to watch, I think, a new generation of Cougar fans. And it comes along, and I've talked often on this podcast. I've been doing this for almost 7 years now, every single day. And there are pockets of BYU history that rope in BYU fans. You want my pocket? It's 1996 with BYU football. And obviously BYU basketball hit the skids as bad as they ever have during that period as well. Was it 97, 98? They went 1-25. But to watch Steve Cleveland rebuild that program, and then to watch Bronco Mendenhall and Dave Rose take the football and basketball programs to new heights in the 20-aughts while I was a student at BYU and obviously moving into the media realm, that's what latched me into BYU football. There are some people who latched on, like I said, in that 20-aughts. There's somebody who latched on in the 1980s, late 1970s with BYU football. There are seasons, if not periods of time for BYU athletics that create new generations of BYU fans. And we may be thinking about this 2024, 2025 year, to use that expression, the school year, as one that launches the next generation of Cougar fans. Thousands of them out there, like I said, my kids' age, who are young, impressionable, and latch on with the Cougs, and they become near and dear to their heart. It's really incredible to consider what BYU is doing right now. And I sincerely hope that we're watching, like I said, this new era of BYU sports dawning. And once again, with the TV rights money coming in, with the NIL and boosters saying we will not be outbid, we could be watching BYU stay at a height or stay at, and maybe even go to higher heights than they've ever been before. Yes, I know they've won a national title in college football. That was in a different era of college football. This era requires you have to win a whole lot more and at a higher level. So if they can go out and accomplish what we're hoping they can accomplish, yeah, we may be watching BYU, that rocket ship, take off, and it may travel higher, further, and longer than we ever could have hoped for. It feels like a few months ago. So incredible stuff. Welcome your feedback. Am I crazy for thinking that? Are we watching? Are you thinking that BYU, we're short circuiting it and maybe we're jinxing it by talking about it right now? Let me know. I welcome your feedback. Drop them in the YouTube comments below. Send them via social media, or reach out via email, whatever method of madness you want to communicate with me on. Locked On Cougars Insider Group. Get a direct text line to me. So, the plug for that to join the Locked On Cougars Insider Group. But coming up next, who are some of these unsung heroes that I'm watching for BYU basketball, and why are they not getting their proper due? Well, we'll delve into that next, right here on Locked On Cougars. Today's show is brought to you by our friends, a new friend over at Supply House. Get the supplies you need from the site made for skilled trades. That's Supply House. Whether you're into plumbing, HVAC, or electrical work, Supply House is a reliable way to order products online. I talk into a camera for a living and talk into a radio mic for a living. I have a brother who legitimately builds houses. He's a foreman, and I told him about Supply House. Their easy-to-use website is jam-packed with helpful resources and the latest product info to help you get the job done right. Plus, with a complete inventory over 200,000 parts from 400 plus top brands, you'll find exactly what you need, deliver fast from coast to coast. My brother told him about this. He said he's going to look into adding it to his repertoire. So, ever need help with an order, Supply House has that expert support and industry-leading service. You'll always be talking to a real person. And for trade pros looking for that extra edge, their free Trademaster program offers exclusive perks like a dedicated phone line, free shipping, and discounts on every single order. Thousands of skilled professionals are already taking advantage. So now it's your turn. Join the Trademaster program today at supplyhouse.com/TM and start ordering plumbing, HVAC, and electrical supplies with just a few clicks. Plus, use the promo code SH5 for 5% off your first order. Check it out now at supplyhouse.com. Thank you once again for making Locked On Cougars your first listen of the day. Hope you all are doing well on this Wednesday. I'll be frank. Some of you probably are noticing I've got some backs under my eyes. I have not slept a lot this week. I've had a lot on my plate, obviously, with my radio job and this podcast, more so than ever. But I am just ecstatic to be watching this BYU basketball team doing what it's doing. Monumental run here, 7-game win streak heading into senior night. They're going to need some extra R&R. Now, the team did stay overnight in Ames due to inclement weather in terms of trying to travel out and fly home overnight. So they'll travel back today. There's some people who actually believe that's in their best interest as athletes. The NBA is looking more into this in terms of, do you travel right after a game or do you stay overnight and sleep? And the trend seems to be more staying overnight and then traveling the next day seems to be better or more optimal for athlete recovery. So BYU's got to get these guys recovered quickly because senior day is coming. University of Utah coming to Provo for senior day. BYU played an extra 10 minutes of a hard-fought game. But the bigger point I want to talk about today is the fact that BYU has got a bunch of what I like to call unsung heroes helping them do what they have done amidst this 7-game win streak. And I want to start off with a guy that he gets his plaudits at points in games, but if you were to watch him singularly throughout a game, you'd be absolutely floored, I think, at the work rate he puts in, and that's Mawit Mag. Remember, Mawit came to BYU known as a defensive stopper, was a standout player during his time at Rutgers, was the Maryland coach called him the best single defender in college basketball, and he was glued to the bench early on this season for BYU. Then we saw in that Wyoming game, if I recall, it was Wyoming game, that Richie Saunders took that shoulder to the face, gets a concussion, a laceration of his lip, and he's out for the game. Mawit Mag steps in and finally sees some extended playing time and really reveals himself to be a really nice piece. Kevin Young said after that game, I've got to find a spot for Mawit to fit into the lineup. And Mawit, during Big 12 play, has become the consummate 3-and-D player for BYU. His offensive repertoire has never been deeper than it is right now. And his defensive chops, man, the dude just absolutely gets after it. And you can tell he relishes the opportunity of playing that stopper role. He takes on the opposing team's best player, wherever they may be on the court, and he just D's them up. He is absolutely relentless. His work rate is incredible. I'm floored. He contributes as much as he does to the offensive side of the floor because he puts out so much energy on the defensive end. And Mawit, he deserves credit for what he is doing because BYU's not where they're at right now without him doing what he's doing. Another guy that I think has come into that similar type role is Trey Stewart. Remember, Trey was glued to the bench deeper than almost anybody in BYU basketball history. He could not find his way onto the court. But since entering in that West Virginia game when this 7-game win streak kicked off, his level of play has ticked up and up and up. And last night, that key defensive series for BYU at the end of the game, he and Mawit Mag were the two defensive stoppers that essentially sealed that win for BYU with that defensive, their defense in that final sequence. Trey is an unsung hero. He doesn't have a huge role. I acknowledge that, but his role, he is fulfilling it to the best of his ability. And he's seeing a little bit of an uptick in his time. Keba Keita, yes, I know his free throw shooting is a concern, but BYU doesn't win that game last night without his 9 offensive rebounds. That chase down block is going to be played in BYU football, BYU basketball highlight reels for eons to come. to chase a guy down full court and go full LeBron James in the NBA Finals on him. What an incredible play. And that should have been an easy 2 points for Iowa State. But it was indicative of the work rate that Keba Keita puts in. He is undersized relative to his height against a lot of guys he plays against in the Big 12, but his freak athleticism, his hops, his ability to go up, track the ball in the air, rebound at a prodigious rate, BYU doesn't win without him. And I think that we have overlooked what Keba brings to the table for the BYU basketball program. And there's still levels for him to get to, it feels like. Can he add maybe a back to the basket game? Can he improve on his free throw shooting where he's not a liability in late game situations? That's the hope for him. But even if that doesn't come, Keba Keita plays a key role, and he's an absolute stud to have on this roster. I will forever be happy that Chris Burgess decided to turn his back on his alma mater in the University of Utah and come back to Provo. And along with him, Keba Keita came via the transfer portal. It has been an absolutely awesome addition to have him on this roster. Other guys to a lesser level have had to adjust their games. Dallin Hall, he's had to share the spotlight with Jaeger Demon at point guard. What did he do last night? All he did is put BYU on his back in multiple circumstances and has a season best 22-point performance. I love Dallin Hall late in games because he's fearless. He will get switched on to big men, and you see him say, okay, he's licking his chops, and he's like, all right, let's watch this. I will forever in my mind remember him sticking that three in the eye of Hunter Dickinson a year ago when BYU got that monumental upset at Allen Fieldhouse over the Kansas Jayhawks. He had a couple of those in this Iowa State game. Dallin, in his heart of hearts, probably wants more of the spotlight like he had last year than what he's had. It's essentially ceding some of that spotlight and maybe a majority of it to guys like Jaeger Demon this year. But Dallin, all he's done is increase his level of play, and BYU's benefited from it. Those are just, was that 4 or 5 guys I just mentioned there? And I even have forgotten guys like Mihailo Boskovic who have had key roles at points. You can look at, obviously, Richie Saunders. He's not an unsung hero. He's just an outright star for BYU. Jaeger Demon's had his moments. Foose put BYU on his back in both West Virginia games to help him win those. The depth and breadth of this roster for BYU is awesome. And it's in some ways similar to what BYU football had. We had a discussion on DJ and PK earlier this week, and the discussion centered on who are the star players from the BYU football program. You can point to is like, that's the guy that led them to glory. There's not really one guy that you can point to. It's hard to pin it down. This BYU basketball team, it's probably more that Richie Saunders is that guy, but even then, Richie's had some fairly quiet games, and other guys have stepped up to fill that void. That is the mark of a really good team, to use that team as what it means. You have a full roster, 11 plus guys who are contributing. And when one guy may not be at his best, I think Foose was struggling mightily against Iowa State. Well, guess what? Keba Keita, Mihailo Boskovic stepped up in the post for BYU in that win against Iowa State. The previous game, well, Foose picked it up for Mihailo and Keba and had that 20-10 performance. It's nice to see BYU getting these performances, as I said, from those unsung heroes, and they deserve their plaudits. I absolutely am enthralled with what Mawit Mag brings to the table for BYU. What a pickup he was in retrospect, because once again, they don't get to where they're at without him, but he's just one of 11 guys here who have been critical cogs in leading BYU to glory this season. It's been a really, really fun ride, and I, for one, I'm not ready for it to end anytime soon. I hope they make a run in the NCAA tournament. I'd love to see them make the Sweet 16, the Elite 8, heaven forbid, finally make it to a Final Four. That may be wishful thinking because, once again, they won with 29 turnovers last night, but I think this is a team that understands that the sum total of the parts is making up for having just one stud player. Remember the Jimmer Fredette era for BYU? Jimmer was BYU on that team, but he couldn't have done it without guys like a Jackson Emery alongside him and some of the other key pieces around him, Brandon Davies and the like. This year's team, it's not as star heavy. It doesn't have Richie Saunders going for 50 plus like Jimmer did at points. he scores 30 plus. That's great. But BYU is a better overall team cohesively, I think, just in terms of the contributions across the roster, how balanced it is, than maybe even that Jimmer Fredette team. And I'm not trying to denigrate the legacy of Jimmer, because that was one of a kind to watch him do what he did back in 2009, 2010, that era. But it's been incredible to watch this rise of this BYU basketball team. And it's doing no small part to the vast contributions from across that roster. And Kevin Young, he deserves to take a bit of that credit as well for finding the right mix of roles for guys and understanding there's times to let guys go and there's other times to pull that leash in a little bit tighter and maybe tighten that rotation at points in games. It's never an exact science, but Kevin Young, he has proven to have a really, really deft touch to helping BYU do what they have done so far this year. All right, we'll finish up today's show on the Big 12 and more the football front of things. Is the Big 12's pursuit of private equity or private capital, is it a bad thing? We'll talk about that next. We wrap up this edition of Locked On Cougars next. Today's show is brought to you by another new friend here on the show. It's our friends over at Post District. Discover Post District, the home to 4 of Salt Lake's newest and most stylish apartment buildings: the Register, Post House North, Post House South, and the 801 Flats. Each residence offers its own unique take on luxury urban living with features like waterfall, kitchen islands, floor-to-ceiling windows, vaulted ceilings, spacious patios, and walk-in closets. Well, they have got me at walk-in closets because I'm interested in this. Enjoy premium amenities, including the city's largest residential gym, a year-round pool, golf simulator, massive TV wall for sports watch parties, and more, all anchored in a one-of-a-kind community. Step outside and find yourself immersed in Salt Lake's hottest dining and nightlife scene with award-winning spots like Urban Hill, Mencho Ramen, Level Crossing, Melancholy Wine Bar, and Sunday's Best just steps away. Whether you're looking for a studio, 1, 2, or 3-bedroom apartment, or even a penthouse, find your perfect home today. Visit liveatpost.com or call 801-590-6247 and mention this ad for an exclusive incentive. Tell them that Locked On Cougars sent you when you make that call. But once again, visit liveatpost.com or call them at 801-590-6247. That's your friends over at Post District. Thank you once again for making Locked On Cougars your first listen of the day. Hope you all are doing well. Another plug for you guys, if you've not done so already, join the Locked On Cougars Insider Group. Get the inside scoop on all things BYU sports and be in the know when it comes to all things Cougars. And the best part is you get a 14-day free trial before you're charged anything. It's just $5 a month after that to be a part of the Insiders Group. So I would encourage you guys to join us today. The link is, by the way, is in the show notes below, whether you're watching this on YouTube or listening wherever you get your podcasts. All right, before we go on today's show, there was some reporting late last week, early this week, that the Big 12 and Brett Yormark have essentially renewed their work in trying to secure funds to hopefully chase down or at least somewhat chase down the SEC and the Big Ten in terms of their payouts and the overall money coming into their programs. Now, it's been labeled as private equity, but the more I read about this, I think that private equity label has been mislabeled into what the Big 12 is looking at, because as I understand it, and our friend Matt Brown over at Extra Points in his fantastic newsletter has pointed this out, that the Big 12 and college athletics in general are not necessarily looking at private equity, because equity, essentially, when you have a private equity firm that signs on to do something, they have a stake and they have, in many cases, a large say in what the future of whatever they're invested in is going to do. That is a step too far, I think, for the 16 members of the Big 12 to allow some private equity firm to have a stake at the table and be able to say, hey, you guys should do this, this, and this. And if you don't, we're going to yank our funding. The difference is it appears that the Big 12 is looking at what is called private capital. Private capital is more where you have these they're funds, they're an equity fund, but the capital invests money into the Big 12, but does not have a seat at the table in terms of the decision-making for the conference. That is where I think that we're kind of missing things here, because knowing what I know of how BYU operates, I'd be hard-pressed to believe that BYU would ever willingly relinquish any type of control over what the future of Brigham Young University and BYU athletics is going to have, and let some equity firm have a say over what BYU, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints who runs it, allow them to direct or send directives to BYU. I just don't see that happening. BYU is not going to let that happen under really any circumstance, just based on what I understand about how BYU operates. Now, if private capital wants to come in this and be that, I don't want to call it a silent partner. That's not really the role that they take, but they invest capital, which is money, into the conference, bolster the athletic departments with that money, and then you move forward with that. Yeah, you sign on with that, no problem, it feels like. This is an arms race, and there's zero doubt that BYU is making more money than they ever have before. I talked about it earlier on in today's podcast that we're living in some pretty incredible times for BYU. They got multi-million / billionaire NIL investments from some of the leading minds in the tech sphere here in Utah. They're making more money in TV rights than ever. But the simple fact of the matter is, if they want to stay flush with cash and continue to compete at the top tier level that the SEC and the Big Ten look poised to take college athletics, and in particular college football and college basketball to, well, you need as much money as possible. And that's where I think this private capital could do some good for the Big 12 conference. I applaud that Brett Yormark is thinking outside the box. Yes, I know it's worrisome when you hear, private equity, because like I said, private equity firms can be a bit of a hiss and a byword, to use that LDS expression, because they can wreak havoc. And I don't think that the Big 12, and especially BYU, would sign on without doing their due diligence on what they're signing the dotted line to do in terms of, okay, how much money you're giving us and what are we having to cede control over. These are your institutions, speaking of universities, who have multi-million, if not multi-billion-dollar endowments. And they're not going to allow, I don't think, really anybody to have a say over controlling what they want to control, and that's their future. So I applaud what the Brett Yormarks of the world are doing here to try and make up that revenue gap for the Big 12 conference. And if I'm wrong about this and it is private equity, yeah, then I have a concern with it. But everything I have read, I think it's been mislabeled. Speaking of, we're taking money from a private equity firm for the Big 12. It's more private capital. And any of you who, like me, are not expert economists, I live with two guys who studied econ at BYU. They're two of my dear friends to this day that are econ majors and have gone to do incredible things in the econ sphere. They can explain it better than I could. Many of you probably know somebody like that. I would encourage you to talk to them about the difference between equity and private equity and private capital. But this is, I think, a course worth following for the Big 12 conference, simply due to the fact that they want to stay relevant on a national stage and avoid that dreaded super conference coming about, and BYU and a handful of other Big 12 schools essentially hoping to win that rat race to make it into that super league. Well, the only way to counter that is to make yourself relevant on a national level. And as we have seen, it's an arms race. I've used that expression a few times today. You have to have money to compete. And I don't see BYU throwing millions of dollars just at what they consider a money pit to stay relevant in college athletics. They'll stay competitive so long as it's in their best interest and it serves the greater interest of Brigham Young University and obviously the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. I think there's a very strong leadership core at the top of BYU, led by Shane Reese and Keith Vorking, who understand what athletics can do for BYU. Tom Holmoe has been a champion for BYU athletics for decades. Whoever takes over that AD chair when Tom steps aside, they obviously will have to champion it as well. But I also think that the Board of Education that leads BYU up in Salt Lake City, I think right now they understand that athletics, it's having a tangible positive effect on BYU, on the church. And so long as that continues, I think you'll continue to see things go the way they're going for BYU. And if it requires a multi-million-dollar investment from a private capital firm that can yet again bolster BYU's chances of competing on a national stage and thereby raising the profile of the university and the LDS church, by all means, go for it. Really, the only thing I think it could pull the reins back on this for BYU is the Board of Education gets skittish if there is a scandal of some sort, or if, like I said, it is a private equity firm and they're just like, we're not so keen on teaming up with somebody who could essentially issue directives to us about what we're supposed to do. That could be the only thing I think that could pull it back from where it's going right now. But so long as there's none of those type of parameters in place, yeah, go for it. Chase down everything you have and every opportunity you have to make up that revenue gap, because The SEC and the Big Ten ain't slowing down anytime soon. And the ACC, as I talked about with Drake Toller earlier this week on the podcast, it feels like it's going to implode in the next 5-6 years because you're going to see those top tier programs in that league bolt as soon as the dollar figure hits a number they feel like they can afford. So if you're the Big 12, forge ahead and try and make up as much ground as you can right now and force it from being that top 2 league discussion to maybe being the top 3 and stay relevant on a national stage. And BYU will be right in the thick of that. And that should excite you as a Cougar fan because that shows that BYU, they're investing heavily. It's strategic. It's smart. They're never going to obviously go out and run in the red. They'll be running in the black. But this is an exciting time once again for BYU sports. And if the Big 12 can get that infusion of capital to make up that gap a little bit more and keep these programs, including BYU, competing on a national level, I'm all for it. Sign them up. Let's do this thing. All right, that's where I'll step off the soapbox for today's show. But as always, thank you for y'all's support. Hope you guys will consider subscribing, rating, reviewing. If you're new to the podcast, like the show, join us every single day. This is daily coverage of BYU sports in podcast form. And we're going more and more, it feels like, to that era where you get what you want when you want it. Well, we're here for you every single day talking BYU sports. So as always, thank you for making Locked On Cougars your first listen of the day. And once again, thank you for being everydayers with us right here on the Locked On Cougars podcast.